Anyway, um, we're in this series and we're wrapping this up this week called Unconditional, and it's about what we find in the Gospel of John, so New Testament. There's those of you who may not know, there's four different basically biographies of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Okay, and we're in John, and we're taking a look at things from his perspective. His perspective, the way he wrote things, it's kind of funny. It's not the way I would tackle things because my brain, I like to work in logical orders. If I can't find an order to things, it doesn't make sense to me. And so I would put everything in chronological order, or at least as best as I could remember. And I'd be, if I wasn't sure about what happened first between two events, I'd be going and asking my friends, hey, do you remember if we did this or that first? And John's just like, forget the order. I want to get the really important stuff in. And if it doesn't come in order, so be it. Um, and there's some surprising things that he included, and then there's honestly some more surprising things to me that he left out that you find in those other gospels, but you don't find in John. We're going to talk a little bit about one of those today. Um, but John chapter 13 is all about this incident where um, we're to the basically the finish line is in sight, so to speak. The cross is going to happen in just a few days. Matter of fact, at this point in time, it's going to happen tomorrow. Um, and so John comes along and he starts telling what Jesus said and did in these last times. And they rented uh, or arranged for, I guess is a better word for it. As far as I can tell, they didn't pay for it. Um, but there was this room above somebody's house that they normally would rent out. And they had arranged to meet there and have the Passover here. Now, Passover was a big feast. It was the biggest feast of the year. Um, and so for the Jewish mindset, this is like their Christmas. This is a big deal. This is as good as it gets. All right. And what it was this big fat reminder that God is their deliverer. Because Israel was once literally in slavery, and it was the kind of slavery that would make the average African American here in the United States from say 200 years ago, you know, thankful for the circumstances that they were in. Because whereas most slave owners here in the U.S. wanted to keep their slaves alive because hey, free labor, right? There was no compunction like that in the Egyptian mindset because they made the Jews slaves to help reduce the numbers. So it's basically the kind of slavery that Hitler would have done. It's that same mindset that the Egyptians had, and so they're working the Jews literally to death every chance they get. They're beating them whenever they slack off. They're making inhuman goals and quotas. Um, it was just a horrible time for the Jews, and they cried out to God, saying, "God, don't you see what we're going through? Can't you get us free from this?" And God responded. And he sent Moses, and Moses dealt with the Pharaoh and basically said, "Let my people go." And there's a series of these 10 miraculous things that we call plagues. Not like a normal sickness and at least not most of it anyway. But there's these 10 plagues that go on. And the final one, the straw that broke that Pharaoh's back, was that basically God sent an angel whose responsibility was to kill every firstborn child. Now there was exceptions because God told the Jewish people what was going to happen. They were warned. And he said, if you want me to preserve your firstborn child or even firstborn adult in the home, what you've got to do is you've got to go find a lamb, you've got to kill this lamb, and you've got to spread the blood on the doorposts of your house. And when the angel of death comes along, it's going to see that and it's going to literally pass over your house. That's where the term comes from, Passover. And so your home would be left intact. There would be no funeral, so to speak, for your home. And all the Jews knew this, and all the Jews, as far as we can see, without fail, obeyed that. However, the Egyptians did not know that. And so the Egyptian firstborn in each home died. And it was that national tragedy that finally broke Pharaoh. And he said, "Fine, go, and don't just go. Take our money and go." Basically, so the Jews got to plunder all the wealth of the richest nation on earth in this stage, and they got to leave. And that's the basic story of Passover. And so God commanded the Jews, said, every year I want you to celebrate this. I want you to go ahead and kind of go through the motions again. I want you to kill a lamb. I want you to go ahead and eat it just like I told you to on Passover. And I want you to celebrate this and remember that I brought you freedom. And that this freedom would give them, instead of being under a burden of slavery that would lead to death, quite potentially for them, it reminded them that they're under the lordship of the Lord of life, that he is watching out for them, that he is in control, and that he is in their corner. And that's what Jesus and his disciples were celebrating tonight in John chapter 13. And when they first come up into that upper room, Jesus does this weird thing. I mean, it was a normal thing in a sense, because roads being what they were, and the Jewish culture being what it was, they're all working from, the ground floor was a dirt floor, just like most houses were, 150 years ago, at least out in the West anyway. And so, but, what's inside is not the same thing as the ground that's outside, especially on the roads. And so they would wash their feet, and that responsibility fell on the lowest servant. Whoever it was that was low man on the totem pole had the chore of dealing with the basic problem of having to wash people's feet. It was not a glamorous task. It was not a happy task. But in this circumstance, Jesus, the rabbi, the master of this group of people, did it himself. And he did it to show these disciples, hey, I want you to serve each other. So even the ugly tasks that everyone wants to avoid, I want you to make a point of doing it for each other. Okay? And he's doing this setting the table for setting the stage, sorry, not the table, for what he's about to say. Because he's got something new in store for them. And if you know Jesus and you look at his teachings, when he's teaching, he basically goes through things like this. You heard it said that the ancients were told, you shall not kill. And that's true. But I'm telling you, there's a higher commandment, that there's a higher standard I want to hold you to. It's not just don't kill somebody, don't commit murder. I want you to make sure that there's no anger in your heart for somebody else. That there's no place for rage and unforgiveness in your heart. Because if that's there, then you might as well have killed them. Emotionally, spiritually speaking, you've already committed murder in your heart. Basically says the same thing like for lust. It says if you look at a woman with lust for her in your heart, then you have already committed adultery with her in your mind. And so, spiritually, there's all the consequences that come with that. And so he holds us as Christians to a higher standard than the law ever asked of us. So if the law is asking, saying, you've got to basically be able to clear this bar, Jesus is saying you've got to clear this bar. There's not many people who can jump that high. And spiritually speaking, there's no one that can. And Jesus is literally giving these set of tasks that are, humanly speaking, impossible to do. But there's a key to it all. I wanted to go ahead and back up a little bit and kind of cover a little bit, because in the same story, after Jesus washed disciples' feet, there's a story about Judas. And if you know the story, one of the 12 disciples who's been traveling around with him for 3 years, Judas Iscariot, at this stage in time had been tempted and had made a concrete plan and had received payment even to betray Jesus. And so that is in motion. And Jesus talks about this in this conversation. So I want to go ahead and back up. And we're going to start off in John chapter 13. And let's see, we start up in
Verse 21.
thank you. I don't know why I was trying to look so much earlier, but I was. All right, here we go. So, verse 21 says, Now Jesus was deeply troubled, and he exclaimed, I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me. Now, I just want to pause there for a minute because again, this is not a small statement. This is a huge thing. If you've traveled around with somebody for 3 years plus, you know those good people. You've lived with these people through thick and thin, through hard circumstances, because let's face it, you guys know if anyone's ever taken a road trip, you're exhausted at the end of the day. Now just imagine a 3-year road trip.
On your feet.
Yeah, on your feet. There you go. Exactly. It's exhausting. These guys knew each other in some hard circumstances. And so it is, they've seen their true colors, okay? They know all the dirty details of each other's lives. They know who gets irritable when the weather's hot. They know who whines when it's cold. They know whose farts smell the worst. They know all the details of each other's lives. And so for Jesus to come along and say, one of you guys is going to betray me, brought these guys to the core. It's not a small statement. Somebody you've been walking around with and living with for 3+ years, you just hear is going to betray not only the master, but in a sense, it's going to be everybody. Because, I mean, all these guys signed on to be like Jesus. They wanted to learn from him. They wanted to be just like him. That's what the goal was of being a disciple of somebody. And somebody's going to trade all that off in for some money. And you look at it, it wasn't even that much money. It was less than $500. It was less than $400. Depending on which silver piece you're talking about, it might have been less than $100. Talk about cheap friendship. And he's telling them this. So that's kind of what we're at. So getting back to this, verse 21 says, Now Jesus was deeply troubled, and he exclaimed, I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at each other, wondering whom he could mean. The disciple Jesus loved, which is John's way of talking about himself, was sitting next to Jesus at the table. And Simon Peter motioned to him and asked, Who's he talking about? So the disciple leaned over to Jesus and asked, Lord, who is it? And he asked quietly, at least Jesus answered quietly, I guess I should say. Jesus responded, It is the one to whom I give the bread I dipped in the bowl. And when he had dipped it, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. When Judas had eaten the bread, Satan entered him, and then Jesus told him, Hurry and do what you're going to do. None of the others at the table knew what Jesus meant. Since Judas was a treasurer, some thought Jesus was telling him to go and pay for the food or to give some money to the poor. So Judas left at once, going out into the night. Now, one thing I found out this week that I missed in talking about this last week is that apparently there was a Jewish custom, kind of like a toast for our culture. This idea of ripping off a piece of the bread and dipping it in like some gravy or something and handing it with somebody was kind of like what we would do to toast somebody. So Jesus is literally going to Judas and he is honoring him and showing extra love to Judas Iscariot, who he's literally saying, hey, if you're going to go do this, go do it. In the same breath, he's honoring him. And that's important because it's good to know that even the man who is most fundamental, who's an even bigger betrayer than, I just drew blank on the name. Benedict Arnold. American culture has Benedict Arnold, right? Judas is the most fundamental traitor that there's ever been. He is, in Western culture, there's no one who's known for it better. And yet Jesus is here honoring him and telling him in his own way, I still love you, even though I know what you're about to do. And it's time to go do it. I still love you. And that's such a powerful truth. But he doesn't stop there. So Judas goes out. Let's pick things up. So let's see, it's right here, verse 31. It says, as soon as Judas left the room, Jesus said, the time has come for the Son of Man to enter into his glory, and God will be glorified because of it. And since God receives the glory because of the Son, he will soon give glory to the Son. Dear children, I will be with you only a little longer. And as I told the Jewish leaders, you will search for me, but you can't come where I'm going. So now, I'm going to give you a new commandment. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. Simon Peter asked, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus replied, you can't go with me now, but you will follow me later. But why can't I come with you now, Lord? He asked. I'm ready to die for you. Jesus answered, die for me? I tell you the truth, Peter, before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny me 3 times that you even know me. Jesus had literally just sent Judas out into the night to go betray him. And then he has this conversation. And this just, to me, this whole thing starts off with Jesus saying, hey, I'm about to be glorified. And you stop and you think about it. Hanging on cross is not exactly what I would call to be glorified. Matter of fact, not only was it an excruciatingly torturous way to be executed, but it was the most shameful way that Rome could figure out to kill somebody. This wasn't just an act of pain and death, it was an act of shame. And so for Jesus to turn around and say that this crucifixion was the time for him to be glorified is completely turning the world up on its head. It's saying this act of shame is going to result in glory. And if I were to go to Jesus' ministry and I were to try to pick out a point in time where I say Jesus was glorified, I would choose a story about what is typically called the Mount of Transfiguration. Okay? So a quick rundown on that is that Jesus took Peter, James, and John, only those 3 disciples, his 3 closest guys, okay? He takes them up on a mountaintop, and suddenly Jesus just changes before their eyes. It's like his robes become white, so bright white that it's like they're shining, and then his face changes, and down comes Moses and Elijah, who, by the way, are dead and have been for a very long time. And he has this conversation with them. I mean, he's literally glowing through this thing. You know, what I find super interesting about this is that we see John saying here, or repeating what Jesus said, that this was a time for his glorification. The crucifixion was a time for Jesus to be glorified. But the Mount of Transfiguration doesn't appear. That story doesn't come in John's gospel. You know where it comes? All 3 other gospels. All 3 other gospels. John left it out, though, don't you? To me, that's weird. I mean, especially when you go and you look at the fact that, John wrote his gospel, and the whole point of it was so that we would believe in him, that he is God, that he is the Messiah, that he's our Savior. That's why John wrote it. So every story he included was meant to drive us to that point. But that's not what it was. That's not what happened. And so John leaves that out because I think he got it. that the things that we call glorious and shiny and new and awesome and wonderful are not the things that God necessarily calls beautiful and glorious. See, from the fall, from Genesis chapter 3 on, when we see Adam and Eve screwing things up, and they screwed it up for the rest of us for the rest of time, basically, um, we got everything turned on its head. And so when Jesus comes along and he starts flipping things up what looks to us upside down, really what he's doing is he's turning things right side up. We're just so backwards and just wrong-headed about everything that it just looks weird. Now, I couldn't think of a good example, but have you ever had something where you saw it wrong? Maybe you've been spelling a word wrong for your whole life, and then you see it right, spelled right, and you're just like, no, that just doesn't look right. But you go to the dictionary and you're like, oh, it is. I've been doing it wrong this whole time. That is what Jesus did in his 3.5 years of ministry. He showed to us time and time again, we've been getting it wrong the whole time. And so he comes along, he does this, and this Mount of Transfiguration, like I said, this glorious thing, John's just like, yeah, it's not that big a deal. And he was there. You know who wasn't there and included in his gospel? Matthew. He was one of the 12 disciples. He wasn't included in that. He didn't get to go witness this. He had to get the story from John or Peter or James or Jesus. He didn't get that himself, but he included it in there. Luke and Mark both, neither of them were disciples in that group of 12. They came along later after Jesus died and rose again. They followed Jesus later. They had to get the story second or maybe even third hand. And they still included it. Why? Because it was a big deal, right? And John's like, yeah, not so much. Why? Why? Because, or at least the way it works in my brain, the way I think John thought about things, I think he kind of understood things and he wanted to share God's perspective a little bit with us. Because God isn't glorified so much in shiny things or in transfigurations or whatever else you want to talk about like that. God is glorified in the fact that God is love. And when we love, we see him glorified. Whether we're loving God directly, like he says in the first and greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then he tacks onto it. And the second is just like it. Love your neighbor like you love yourself. And so he's saying, I think what Jesus is saying here is that he's glorified through love more than he would ever be through these wonderful, miraculous things that we see. Because that's one thing. I mean, for all the things that God is, he's holy, he's just, he's glorious, he's beautiful, he's wonderful, he's powerful. All those things and so many other adjectives I could throw his direction. The one thing he really used to describe himself is God is love. That's so vitally important, which is why he goes on and he says after, when he's talking about this being glorified thing, he says, as soon as Jesus left the room, Jesus said, the time has come for the Son of Man to enter into his glory, and God will be glorified because of him. And since God receives the glory because of the Son, he will soon give the glory to the Son. Dear children, I will be with you only a little longer. And as I told the Jewish leaders, you will search for me, but you can't come where I'm going. So now I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. So he's talking about being glorified, and then he's like, oh, I'm going to be glorified, but I want you to love each other. And not just the normal commandment of love your neighbor like you love yourself. I mean, that's pretty hard to do because I love myself an awful lot. I don't know about you guys. I'm pretty self-centered. Ask Tanya, ask Elijah, ask Joshua, ask Caleb. He's over in the nursery. But ask anyone who knows me well. My dad could tell stories probably from my childhood about how self-centered I was. And honestly, I don't think you guys are any different. But that's just the way we're wired. We're selfish. We love ourselves quite well most of the time. Not saying we don't have moments, but for the most part, we love ourselves really well. And so for God to come along and say, love your neighbor like you love yourself, that's no small task. Okay? But now suddenly it's like, hey, I want you to love your neighbor like I have loved you. Like Jesus himself, God, the infinite being who has an infinite capacity for love, who loved us so much he died on a cross for us. I want you to love each other like that. Kind of a mic drop moment in my mind, if you stop and you think about it. But you know what I find interesting is Peter's reaction. Have you ever been part of a conversation and somebody says something that just makes you fixate on that statement? And it's like the rest of what they're saying is just falling on deaf ears. You're just not listening. You can't get past this one thing they said. You're in there, you're zoned in, you know exactly what they're saying. But after that, they could say the sky is falling and you don't even pay attention. You're not listening. It doesn't register. It goes in one ear, out the other, and you're just right there on that statement. That's Peter, okay? Peter is right here. So what does he fixate on? It's not this commandment to love each other. Verse 36, Simon Peter asked, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus replied, you can't go with me now, but you will follow later. Now, for most of us, I think that would be enough. I think most of us would say, I can't go now, but I get to go later. Okay, I get to be with him later on. I don't know how much later. He didn't give us a time frame, but I do get to be with him. That's good enough for me, okay? Not Peter. Peter, Mr. No filter between his brain and his mouth, just keeps right on in. Says, but why can't I come with you, Lord? Can you hear the whiny voice? That's what I do. Yes, exactly. Why can't I come? I remember one time, I don't remember where he was going, but my dad had asked me, hey, do you want to come with me? And I said no. I wanted to play. And so he gets in the car and starts driving off. And I just remember changing my mind in that moment, watching him get in the car and start to drive off. And like a little kid, I start running after him and waving, Dad, no, I changed my mind. Wait, I want to go. And either he didn't hear me, didn't see me, or he saw it. He's like, Ross, you chose. I'm gone. And he did. He drove off without me. It wasn't tragic. It wasn't like neglectful or anything, but I was not alone. I just wanted to go with my dad. That in my mind, that's the way I can hear Peter sounding. He's got that whiny little voice. But why can't I come now, Lord? He asked. I'm ready to die for you. And that's a very bold statement. How many of you are willing to say that honestly for anyone else? Most parents would be willing to die for their kids. I get that. But what about, the person who lives 4 doors down from you? Would you be willing to die for them? And my answer is no. I've not met the person who lives 4 doors down from me. Doesn't matter which direction you go, I haven't met him. That's how good a neighbor I am. So Peter just, again, no filter between the brain and the mouth. He says, I'm ready to die for you. And Jesus answered, die for me? I tell you the truth, Peter. Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. He's talking about just a few hours from now. Because we saw earlier when Judas left that he left out into the night, into the darkness. It's dark. Roosters crow at or before the sun comes up. Okay? Just a few hours later, Peter's going to be lying and saying he never met Jesus. It's just such a huge deal. Peter, he just fixated on the fact that Jesus was going somewhere, that he misses out on this whole new commandment to love each other. And I stop and I think, isn't that us? Why did Peter fixate on that? Because he's scared. He doesn't want to be left behind. He loves Jesus. I don't think there's any question about that. He doesn't want to get left behind. He's scared. And isn't that you and me? We get fixed on something that we're scared about and we forget about everything else. Here's a powerful motivator. But what Jesus is trying to introduce the disciples and you and me to is the fact that love is a far stronger motivator. Once we land on it, once we understand it, once we've accepted that love and we start turning that around and giving it out to the people around us, we understand love is a super strong motivator. That's why parents are willing to die for their kids. Anyway, so Peter couldn't bring himself to die for Jesus until after Jesus had died for him. Did you notice that? I mean, Peter's all talk right here. He thinks he's willing to die for Jesus. But when the time comes, just a few hours after this, he lies to save his own neck. But after Jesus died on the cross, after he rose again, and after it's such a mind-blowing thing to me. You know, for the time period between when Jesus died and Jesus rose again, and then after that until, well, really about that time, Peter is living in fear. He is absolutely ruled by phobia, that he's scared that the same mob that lynched Jesus is going to come for him. He and his friends are literally hiding in this upper room they had arranged for. They're not going out to buy food. They're staying hidden because they're scared what the mob is going to do. And Peter, who is not willing to die for Jesus, not really, suddenly, man, after Jesus rises and after he goes and has a conversation, and if you know the story, I just want to paint the picture for you anyway. And I want you to stop and put yourself in this picture. You're there in this upper room. Jesus has died. You've been scared too. And you're hiding. And then 3 days after Jesus died, at dawn, Jesus rises from the dead. And suddenly he comes to talk to everybody. And you're overjoyed that he's alive. You've spent 3.5 years with him, walking, talking, all that. And he's back from the dead. You're excited, right? Peter, what's his reaction? He's filled with shame. He's horrified because he did exactly what Jesus said he was going to do right here. He denied he knew Jesus. Said, I don't even know the guy's name. I'm just here for the thrill of watching someone get executed, you know? That's what his lie was. And Jesus died for him, and then he comes and he talks to Peter and basically says, hey, look, it's okay. I forgive you. And that's not exactly what he said, but that's the core of what Peter heard. It's okay. I knew what you're going to do. I love you anyway. I died for you anyway. And so what we see is Peter's life gets revolutionized from this point. He's a different person. And that's you and me too. That when the gospel, and this whole story is the gospel, it's Jesus dying for you and me and receiving the same forgiveness that Peter received right there. When that takes root in you, it revolutionizes our lives too. Peter was changed. He ended up dying. Well, we don't have it from the Bible, but we have various historical sources that say that Peter was crucified because he followed Jesus even after he died and rose. After Jesus is gone from the picture, he's ascended up into heaven. Peter is following Jesus for all he's worth, and he ends up getting crucified. But he's like, no, no. This torturous, excruciating way of dying is too good for me. I don't deserve to die like my Savior died. Crucify me upside down because hey, let's take it one notch worse, right? Peter was changed. He ended up dying for Jesus. So the very thought that he had, that he stated here, that Peter said, "I'm ready to die for you," he wasn't then. But just a few years later, just a few days later, he was. He changed. And that's such an awesome thing, because to think that somebody can move from being fearful and thinking they're dedicated, thinking he signed on all the way, and finding out horrifyingly and embarrassingly and shamefully that he's not sold in, that he hasn't bought in all the way yet, despite what he thought. And it's the same for us. And you can feel fully dedicated, but until you receive the good news, how we needed his death in order to receive his forgiveness, we simply can't be wholly dedicated. And I'm convinced that there's tons of people who go to church on a semi-regular or maybe even a regular basis. Honestly, I bet you there's pastors out there who are out there preaching just like I'm doing now. And I don't think that there's some of them that haven't received the gospel, not genuinely. I've heard stories of it.
Are you saying like you have the knowledge of it,
Mhm.
you're changed, and it hasn't hit?
Exactly. Because I've heard the longest road is the 18 inches from your head to your heart. And it's just so true. We can believe something, but if I believe that a chair is going to hold me up, I'm willing to sit in it. But if I don't believe it's willing to sit in it, it looks rickety, and I'm like, ain't no way I'm putting my weight on there. I'm gonna get hurt.
But Peter walked on water.
He did.
And then fell back and then came back.
He did. He was a man of extremes. Like I said, there's no filter. There was no pause for him in that story when they're in the stormy sea, and he sees Jesus walking across this huge body of water casually, and he's just like, "Lord, if that's you, ask me to come out." Jesus says, "Well, then come on out."
So he must have made it and then fell back in his faith when it came to hard times. But really, that was what got him. He had it when he walked on water. He must have.
And he had some faith for sure. He had some faith because, like I said, there's no filter. But I don't know. It is.
If we looked at each one of our lives, we would have parallels to that. And it would be nuts.
And then all of that I call it empty knowledge.
That's a good way to put it.
Internal is empty knowledge, and it causes that deep crash, if you will.
Yeah, it's trivia until it changes you.
There ain't no,
Yeah, and then that faith just brightens you back up, but
there's
Yeah.
no fake faith that makes you walk on the water. He made a mistake and God forgive him.
Oh yeah, for sure. And that's all of us.
Thank God.
But I think because if you also look, there's another place, I believe it's in Matthew, but I can't remember for sure. Jesus is telling a story of what would happen in the future, basically on the day of judgment. You got everybody coming before God. And there's, of course, there's people who denied him the whole time. And then there's people who've come and they've confessed the name of Jesus, and they say they're believers. And Jesus sorts those people out. And he says that basically the core difference is that I never knew you. That you are not in a relationship with me. This was a thing to do, not presence. And he even talks to these people about the same sort of things. Like, you guys cast out demons in my name. You guys healed people in my name. You did stuff in my name. Miracles happened, and you were a part of that, and you got to see all of that, but you never knew me.
He also says that they cast out demons in your name, Rabbi. And he said, if they're not against us, they're for us.
He also says elsewhere that if you're not for me, you're against me. Just to make things abundantly clear. I think it's allegiance isn't the word I would use. It's about faith and belief. It's about wholehearted believing something versus half-heartedly believing something. So I think that's what it comes down to in my mind. But anyway, so the point is, what? Sorry.
I think it has to do with intent. Like you intend to do the right thing, or you intend to serve yourself.
I think there's a lot of that. Sure. That's not going to be every case for everybody. Some people honestly think they are, but it's just they've never really genuinely 100% trusted themselves to God. So I think that makes all the difference in the world. But anyway, I really want to just break things down really quick here at the end, because it really does come down to the fact that Jesus is giving them a new commandment. Love each other like I have loved you. This is the thing he wants them to get about doing. This is the mark of a believer. This is how you tell who is and who isn't. Is how well they love other people. And that's scary because let's face it, you walk out of these doors and you start going down on random doors, knocking. You ask, is the church known for being loving? And the answer, I think, would be a majority of the time, it would be no. You go to other parts of the country, it's going to get to be an even higher percentage. It's going to become a super majority, to say the least. We're not known for being loving.
You are. This one wrong.
Jesus is known for being loving. He's the only one who's got it down. But the point is that once the gospel takes root in us, once we really come to that point of understanding what Jesus did for us, that he paid the price for us on the cross, he lived the perfect life, the life that you and I can't live, and he died the death that you and I have earned, let's just say at least 1,000 times over. And because of that, we can spend eternity with him. And it's the price of admission is just simple faith. It doesn't have to be a ton of it. It has to be enough to change what you're doing. Change the way you're living. Because if you don't change, did you really believe? I mean, honestly, stop and think about it. That's the mark of belief. Just change what you do. If you don't believe your computer's going to boot up, are you going to push the power button? Belief dictates actions. It just does. And what we believe about God is the central defining characteristic for every single human being on this earth. And do we believe God? As a church, do we believe God enough to try to love like this? I've seen it. I think everybody here, pretty well everybody here, to some degree or another. And I know that life's going to give us opportunities to see that more fully. But ultimately, you're the only one who can figure that out. You and the Holy Spirit, you got to come to God. You got to say, okay, look, God, I need your insight. I need to have your eyes for a minute just to see into the depths of my soul. All the little nooks and crannies that we like to forget about, I need to understand it. Do I really believe? And then do I really love like you've asked me to? And I can't answer that for you. I can't even answer that for my kids or for my wife. Heck, I'm not sure I can answer that for myself some days. It's going to take you going to God. Why would you go to God, though? But simply put, you got a relationship with him. That's what it comes down to. That's why that first commandment is love the Lord your God. With everything you got, love him. And the second part of that, love your neighbor like you love yourself, or as he upped it here, love your neighbor like I have loved you. You're not going to be able to do that without the first part. You cannot do that. Because until you understand the love and the forgiveness and the grace and the goodness and the truths and everything else that God has to give us, we can't pass that out because we don't have it.